People are waking up in Marvel Rivals. They realize more than ever that positioning is more important and nuanced than you realize. And of course, getting eliminated has a massive impact towards your overall team and running back that time and staggering. Remember, some plays you go against the grain. Sometimes you just can stand out in the open and just brute force it because you played as a team. So remember the concept: you win as a team, lose as a team when it comes to positioning. You can see better positioning, but if nobody else is doing it, it may not work for you. So after today's video, you will understand positioning better in Marvel Rivals. I initially did a first take and I was trying to add all of attack and defense on this, but what we're going to just see today is just strictly attacking with as much excruciating detail and explanation in an empty server with just me using the new Midtown Convoy map. The idea is that you can apply this concept to other maps. So let me know if you want a part 2 to see the defensive side, which I think is just as interesting. So let's just say part 2. Next Tuesday, we'll do all of defense. But I realize that this is really long and I didn't want people to kind of get lost in between, and so we're just using this strictly for attacking. So here's the format. What we're going to do is we're going to cover each point of interest. We're going to go from the start of just from point A to point B for the first one, and then the next two, as we start getting the core concepts, we're going to move a lot faster. Now, again, it's long because we're going to cover the range DPS thought process, then the melee DPS thought process, then healers and how they would position, then how tanks would play it, and how dive overall go for it, which is kind of a mix of Hulk, let's say Spider-Man or Venom, and so forth. There's a little bit of a blending there when it comes to disruption. Then we're, again, like I said, we're going to try to do both attack and defense, but today's video is just attack. So please leave a like if you want a part 2. It's going to be long. It's going to be very nuanced. It's not going to be for everybody, but I promise you, if you sit down, the idea is you get the core concepts in terms of positioning down, you're going to be much better for it. So don't forget to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know what you thought about this. I'm trying to be better in terms of listening to go into more of the details, and this is my first step at it. Let's see how we do. Now here's a quick reminder that everything we're doing you can do in a custom game as well. Just make sure that whenever you're doing this, that you click on Quick Match, that you click on the icon on the right that says Custom Game, and then you create your own game, and then you can go into the round. So this one's pretty easy. It's already set up. We're looking at Midtown, so let's go and do a Midtown map, and let's get into the very first step. The first term that we're going to learn together is, what is a stagger? A stagger is very interesting because people think that this means that it's people positioned separately. People could call it overextending. People call it running in one at a time, which is also probably the most common thing that you also see as well. But a stagger is essentially, let's say, for example, we lose one teammate. They are no longer here. They are gone. But we have a teammate that runs back in. Now, let's say their journey, they're almost there, but we lose 2 more teammates, right? And those people are spawning in, and maybe they go the other direction because there's 2 spots whenever you can spawn in, for the most part, especially at the start, and they start running in. And by the time they get here, all 3 of these poor teammates here, we're going to just draw it in red, get eliminated all at the same time, right here. Now, the stagger happens where each of these 3 that at this one moment were in have finally caught up and gotten to an ideal position here. But the problem is that those in red that we had just discussed are still gone and staggered to come back in later. Now, the unfortunate part is that the other team, because they have been working so well together, have been able to isolate them out, and let's say they knock out that last bit there. That is what we mean by a stagger, of running in 1 at a time, and sometimes it can be 2 at a time, or even 3 at a time. In this example, we see 3 at a time. So do not stagger, wait for your teammate, wait for your proper tank, move forward as a unit, and do not think that you're going to become the god of the team and carry. You play as a team, you lose as a team. In this section, we're going to discuss what is a frontline and a backline specifically. So for this example, we have 2 tanks. They're going to be blue. They are the front line. Then perhaps what we have is 2 healers that are nearby. This is still the front line. They could be in the back line if they choose to, but this is still generally the front line. And then we have the last 2, which are the DPS, either in the far back or perhaps diving. So the front line, just to add even more clarity, we'll go ahead and just do a whole different color here. The front line is usually this little box here, the box that's happening. And then the dive can go into the other box, into their opponent's front line or perhaps back line to do some significant damage, just say Venom, Spider-Man, Black Panther, anything of that line. The back line is that maybe perhaps the healers are stepping outside of that front line box and moving to the back line right here. And that's where they get snagged out. You can be in the front line, you can be in the back line, but if your back line starts getting destroyed, this box can also become a little smaller here. So that is the difference between a frontline and backline. It can be a little bit variable. It could be a little bit tighter. It could be a little smaller depending on how you position and where you stand with your team. For the most part, I guess the most simple answer when it comes to in terms of backline is going to be your healers in the back with some range DPS as well. And if we redo this again and we say, what is the front line? Well, the front line is going to be your tanks with perhaps a melee DPS pushing the front line. So that is a big difference in distinction of telling the difference between frontline and backline DPS. Now that we've already covered frontline and backline, and of course staggering, I'm going to showcase one of the most common mistakes that most players will make, and that is running outside of the point before it's even ready. Now, I didn't do anything crazy for this, and I just put it right here for now because they're just going to run up over here. Because most of the time, you'll see streams that throw it outside the map. They'll put it and block it over on this area over here, because this is another area in which you can spawn in, and they'll pretty much trap an enemy team for a designated amount of time. Another thing you'll see is that people will put penny mines located here to kind of stalk you, make sure that they come and grab you afterwards, or they'll just hover right above. I've seen where hover characters will be above, or whenever you rush out, perhaps there might already be a Punisher that is holding this designated area already here. Now, that leads to the first point, is that it's very big that if you actually use the spawn at times, if you are a ranged DPS and you stand here and you shoot, right? That's probably one of the most important things. So the first tip, I know I don't want to overextend and go from attack to defense quite yet, but first we're going to start on the defensive side, but I figured this is one of the most important tips because it's a big mistake. Just don't run out the door. Please stop doing it. Don't run out that door. Remember your positioning. You do have a strength. You can assess the situation. Wait 2 seconds. Check your left and right. Look both ways before you cross the street. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to cover as much as we can up until, and I'm going to just fly a little bit forward here, because you would think that I would cover up until a certain specific moment, but we're going to cover up until here. The convoy is going to move forward. You're going to hear it in the background. Apologize for that. I'll be sure to lower the volume as much as I can. Now, what we're going to discuss is, remember, the first tip that I had mentioned is to make sure to check both left and right whenever you leave the door. Another thing is that you do have alternative routes. Now, as a range, you can also just peek and see, okay, where are people located? This gives you information. Usually there's somebody probably holding here. Remember, there are people that can flank this way. And if you move up, you can start using the pillars here, or your healers are more likely going to stand here. And you can also start to cut the corner and look for information to isolate people out for 1v1s. This is a tactic used in most FPS games in general. It's just isolating out for as much 1v1s as possible. Now, the unfortunate part is that the enemy team is usually always bulking up right here, which is fine, because then you could also do the alternative path as range to do this angle to maintain pressure and catch people out. Because you have this, the car almost provides a bit of cover right here, just to give you some of that poke that you're looking for, depending on the height of your character, of course. And it doesn't seem like a lot, but it does provide a lot more than you realize in terms of the starting area. Plus, look at this. A health pack is here in terms of getting that bit of poke damage. So you have the health reset located here, and then you have the health reset located over here as well. Now, you do have another path located over here as you start to flank. As a ranged DPS, as you start to move forward, let's say everyone is moving up further along the line up until this point, you can start to play this backline. So one mistake that ranged DPS make is that they always move up to always shoot, but look how far you can still shoot even though you're backing up and keeping your hitbox small. This is going to apply for flying DPS as well. So that's really, really important to remember. Of course, you have stairs here. You have this whole back area at your disposal as well. The downside of doing this, we have to make sure that your front line is holding it steady in the front right there. And so you need to, if you do this by yourself and you start flanking right here and everyone's already located here, that is not good because all they're going to do is turn and absolutely obliterate you. It's not going to work. So make sure as a ranged DPS that you decide how you're going to position what you're going to do. It's not a bad thing if you go for that if nobody's paying attention to you, but I promise you if you're running into a higher skill lobby, they probably are and they're going to see you. Now, let's talk about this from a Flier standpoint real quick, shall we? Now, as much as I'm going to do my best to explain every single different version of this, unfortunately, we are just going to run out of time, and I could do this for literally hours on end. So remember that. As long as you're getting concepts, before anybody comments and says, but you missed this, you missed this. But of course, as long as you're getting the core concept, that's the goal. Now, when it comes to being a flyer, the worst thing you can do is just kind of funnel in the back. Remember, another tip is that you could funnel behind a Doctor Strange and just keep DPSing and keeping this line up. But as you come out, the biggest thing, make sure that you use your flight to its advantage, and you can still still jiggle peek this way, right? And you're looking at your LOS and finding those unique spots as you start to move, because then people have to look up. And most of the time people don't inherently look up. It's not natural for them to do so. They kind of feel uncomfortable as they're moving around. But this gives you the ability to find those weird little nuanced spots like this right here. Like this is pretty nasty as you start using that cover. It's blocking half your body. As you start to move up right here, let's say they're right here, they're in the back, and you start to kind of just head peek, you know, you become a real big annoyance for your enemy team. Now remember, the higher you fly up, especially a storm, you're going to lose that buff for your teammate. At the same time, it gives you a lot of strength, including in the back end over here, as you start to look for people. If they're right underneath you right here, and you start to just kind of peek on top of them, it's really strong. And if you move up to this point, this is a really strong spot because you have a lot of cover. This is kind of where I was racing to, essentially, where you have all this cover in the back, and you have this sign to give you this cover, and then you can even use the cars as you're moving above them to start giving you that cover that you're looking for. Use pillars to buy yourself some time for your healers and back up. It's almost like using checkpoints that we discussed with our other positioning guide. Where is your checkpoint and which you're going to go? This will cover a lot of ranged DPS here, because then we're going to switch over to melee and talk it through. Because the worst thing you can do is, remember, for melee, this is most likely going to be down here. But the last thing you want to do as a flyer is be stuck and have nowhere to go, because you're just going to hit your head. If you find those more open areas, then it's going to make it a lot easier for you. So you need to take that height right away. You fly to different angles. You move around. You look down right here at them. You know, you start to get a little creative, and especially because you are able to flank at this point. And let's say you go all the way around as a flyer, maybe like Iron Man, and then you have a health pack. You use the health pack against them. Remember each of your health packs. You got one that we discussed, you got two over here, and then you got three over here. And that's just for the starting point. Just for the starting point. Now, how many different areas that are much stronger? And then four. Just flying over to it. Sorry. Took me a second. There's so many different ones that you can do as we look at them that are your checkpoints that give you a lot of strength and flying around. So just remember that. Try to keep your hitbox as small as possible as you're moving around, as you're finding those little areas. That there's a lot more than taking the front line and just brute forcing the spot. Everyone tends to brute force right here, which is fine, especially whenever you corner your opponent and you're on defense and you're really struggling. Sure, I can understand how that could be a thing. But you have to keep in mind where everyone else is positioned and how you can flank them, especially if they're holding that line so well. All it takes is for one person to start going around here, and becoming an absolute pain, because then that focus that was once here starts to get pulled away, and they'll start to dwindle in who they're focused on, and they'll stop playing as a team. And that could be hard, especially when you have so many different variances. This is why at this point here, just to kind of skip ahead just a little bit before we reset, why it can be really hard for defense to hold here is because you not only have the convoy as cover, and if you did not know, you can actually heal on the convoy, is that this provides a lot of cover moving up for defense. And then you're probably wondering as well, why does it feel like it's so difficult? Remember all the flying tips that I had mentioned? And then flanking left and right? You really have less options here. And so any flyers, whether it's Star-Lord, whether it's Storm, anybody who happens to have any issues right here is going to struggle a lot more, because you're forced to just be on the ground. You're on the ground here, you're more on the ground here, and you're more on the ground here. And so this is why this becomes more of a choke point right here, rather than the backline over here. I mean, there's so much space over here as well that nobody ever utilizes, and it doesn't get utilized that much because this whole back spot tends to be easy to push from. It's not really much of a concern. It might help you if you're a dive to go all the way back here, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But remember, as a attacker, this is much easier to kind of gravitate towards. And this is really your only nuance on the other side there that you really have to worry about. You realize that these health packs can be leveraged for you and against you, and as you start moving forward, you'll start to see less of them. I mean, they're still around. Don't get me wrong. We can sit here and point out every single one like we did right there, but really explore and really think about it. So now we're going to let's take a look at this from a melee DPS perspective. Now that we kind of got the flyer perspective as well. So let's take a look at that. And remember, look both ways before you exit as a melee DPS. This section we're going to discuss melee DPS. Now, sometimes, like I said, you could brute force it. You could run out here. You could be the Wolverine. You could go for some insane, kidnap. Somebody happens to be right here. You bring them back and you DPS them down. That is a possibility. It could be most straightforward. Remember, I had mentioned the alternate route over here to get you in. Let's say you are over here with a healer. Remember, the downside is if they see you over here, they might isolate you out. But sometimes it could be so hard focused on that front end They won't even think about you. There's two places in the melee. You could still keep brute forcing forward, which is perfectly fine, or you can start to flank over on the side and start to pick out some of that DPS, right? You can find somebody on the back line. Perhaps you find that tank. You say, yeah, I got you. And then you bring them all the way back or push them forward, whichever one you want to do, because this could be a great way to sneak. Remember when we talk about positioning as a melee, a lot of that is utilizing your third-party peeks. You don't have to come right around the corner here. You can definitely peek it out to see where they're at and who's overextended. You find that tank and then you bring them right back to you. That's another option. Remember, do this for all characters. This is why you see a lot of people when they're playing Spider-Man, when they're playing Black Panther. It's not that they are AFK and they're not playing the game. It's that they're looking for that opportunity. And third-person peeking is going to be your biggest strength as you're moving around to look what's nearby, because it is your biggest defense instead of just just bluntly just running out in the open. That is your cover. That is your third-party peeking. And same thing as you're taking the stairs and moving around. As a melee, every bit of damage matters because you need to be able to survive. You don't have a fallback per se. You do have some mobility depending on who you're playing, but you need to make sure that you're not just bluntly just like, hi guys, I'm here and I'm going to melee. No, that's usually what happens when a dive doesn't know what they're doing and they can't find the weakest person. They're going for a Hail Mary. But if they wait long enough and they find that moment of truth and they fall back, let's say like they're looking right here and they're peeking, and they see somebody, and they get them, they use all their abilities, you know, they do all kinds of stuff, they bring them down, they blah, 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 and there's a health pack, and then they go run around, and they bait back to their healer, right around this corner as the convoy starts pushing, just like a flyer. Think of like a flyer, but on the low ground. Then you start using this for cover, and then you back up, and then make sure you don't get hit, and then you're back up, and then you start pushing again, using your abilities and rotating. Even, I'm not even the best Wolverine, and I know how to position and move around, because it's just that basic fundamentals across the board. And this will, I promise you, if I can do it, you can do it, ladies and gentlemen. You can do this as well, and it'll save you so much time, and you'll become so much better of a player. And you can comment and say, I wouldn't do that, but listen, just make sure that you survive and you're using proper cover as melee. And at first I was thinking this guy to cut it up to this point, but what we're going to do is we'll do each section. So each of these sections is going to be based on the point above. So we've covered all the way up to the point. Remember, you can also use these areas right here. This is why it's so good for attackers. At this point, makes it so much easier. If you want to flank around, you almost don't even need to, but it is important just to realize that there's health packs over here. There's one over here. It's why you start seeing the melee just kind of mess with the back line and start to push and start to do whatever they need to do. Instead of going forward, remember, if your convoy's here, that you can use these pillars. You can have a storm on the top end and you on the bottom end, and you just keep pushing and then looking for those opportunities as you're moving. Because your cover is really designed into knowing information of what you're getting into. Because the last thing you want to do is, especially, you look around the corner and you see all 6 of them sitting there looking forward. Because what are they going to do if you look right here and you see all 6? Let's say you see a Magneto, a Doctor Strange. You see just all 6 of them standing right in front of you. And you say, you know, I'm going to go for it. Well, if your team is all the way back over there, you're going to get eliminated. That's it. This is where dive, I mean, I'm not trying to confuse it too much with melee, but melee in general, if you're trying to move in, don't overextend. Know when you've overextended from your team. Now, if you're dive and you're Spider-Man, and some people can play Wolverine as a dive as well, I'm not saying it's not possible, is that you need to have an out. Like if Spider-Man's back here, what you're looking for as a Spider-Man, if there's, let's say, a few people up front, and then you notice that a healer's right here, and you happen to be pretty close right here, and you can snag them, go up, and then hit the med pack, and then fly back out, and then go back to this corner and get healed up by your team, that's the ideal scenario that you're looking for. That's what you're looking for as you're playing a dive. I didn't mean to skip ahead with dive. We'll come back again as a Spider-Man and we'll still show it, but I think it's very important that you take this note and that you look around. While we can sit here and look at every single angle, just as we did, we kind of already have going through. I know that some of it will start to become a little redundant, which is great because it means that we are hitting the right point. You're like, okay, I'm starting to get it, moving around. Then at least you won't do the worst thing, which is just running right out in the open. Now, I will close out with melee, range DPS, and then for even flyer DPS, that it could be possible that you just brute force it right here with all the DPS in the world, and you're able to just strong arm them. That's what I mean, that sometimes playing as a team, losing as a team is important. It is a strategy. It can work. It's not the end of the world. But remember, as you start to realize that they start positioning better, let's say, for example, we go back all the way over here, and we're pushing forward, and they start flanking. They start using this, and then the healers get distracted. The healers get picked off. That's where it starts to become a problem. So let's hop in, and let's talk about this from a healer perspective and where you're going to pretty much stand. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, losing a DPS and a pretty much a tank can be detrimental, yes. But if you lose a healer and you lose both healers, you can almost promise that the team is going to get eliminated if things are at a stall. So don't necessarily always be the one to rush out first. Get an idea of where people are going to stand and how they're going to position. Yes, you are going to want a DPS. If you see this line right here, you put DPS, and let's say you pull somebody in, just as an example, you could stand right here while everyone's figuring their positioning out, and you have an angle to heal. And the same thing happens over here as well. Remember, it's kind of looking at your angles, and if you have a tank that's pushing forward you can hide behind, then you can move here. Remember, you don't want to be overextended. It's always better as the healer if you could be behind a majority of people and you have line of sight of about, let's say, 4 people, 3 to 4. If you got 3 in front, then you know maybe one is flanking, you know one's on the left that you need to keep checking right here, and you can start moving forward. Remember, you don't want to be too far up, you don't want to be too high up to get kidnapped, so to speak. So you start to use the same thing as a melee DPS, and you start to get those angles here. But remember, if you only can see 1 or 2 here, then you're missing the whole picture. So you always want to make sure that you're positioning to where you can see a mass majority of them and that you're standing back. Now, this is going to answer the next question. What if I'm standing too far back and then all of a sudden a Spider-Man and so forth jumps on me? That is a great question, because we talked about that earlier, and we're going to answer that. Is that you need to start to be aware. You can either call that your backline is in trouble, and you start using utility. Let's say Spider-Man jumps on you, you pull him in just as an invisible woman, you start DPSing, and then you move back up into your team, and then hopefully either you finish him or you don't. One of the two happens. You don't want to be too far back, and you do not want to be too far forward. You need to find a balancing act, because the first thing that a dive is looking for is somebody that is too underextended or overextended with their teammate. So as a healer, make sure that you find that balancing act of being within range, not too far of the convoy, not too ahead of the convoy, because another mistake too, let's say you get excited, you say, oh my gosh, I think I can get him, and then you push a little forward, and then you take too much damage and you back up, then you're not healing your allies. You're not being an asset. You're overextending. Now, you could be cloak and dagger in this moment, and you could ult forward for your team to create space, because now they know to move on to your ultimate, right? And you move on to the ultimate, that is also healing your teammates and creating space, which you could do for your healer ultimates as well. But the thing is to make sure what is a safe spot versus what is not a safe spot, because the last thing you want to do as a healer is call attention to yourself. If you realize you're putting too much attention, you're doing too strong of a job, the first thing they're going to do is push you, and they're going to find ways to get you. You want it to be as difficult and as annoying as possible as you start to move forward. So now let's go ahead and segue how a tank would utilize this. And I guess that's where it becomes a lot. Now we've covered all the other ones. I mean, because it's a lot easier. And as we start doing this, I want to speed this along, because a tank really is going to be just more or less the front line. You do have the dive, which will kind of blend, let's say, like a Hulk and a Spider-Man and so forth. It's a little bit different, but the core concept remains the same. So let's discuss that next. All right, now as we keep looking at this, remember, let your tanks go first. They're going to be the first ones to create this structure. Everywhere that we went as a DPS looking for cover, a tank has the ability to find and create space. Now, they also have the ability to just dive, and maybe let's say Hulk were to go up here and then jump on the backline and immediately pull focus for an extended period of time. Your job as a tank is to get aggro and to pull focus, and you really create the pacing of the round. Because here's another thing. A lot of tanks will say, well, what if we just all went over to the right? You could, sure. You could, but you have to communicate that as a team of what you're trying to do and push forward this way to go for the flank. Because the worst thing you can do is that the other line right here is going to push over, and they could accidentally capture somebody who's staggered out. So you have the ability to create space where it doesn't exist. If you play any other game like Apex Legends, like having a Rampart, it's like having a controller legend, it's having Reinhardt in Overwatch. It's bad spaces that wouldn't normally work that now can work for your whole team. It gives options, ladies and gentlemen, as you're pushing forward. It's a little more direct, but it's so important that you maintain spacing and you maintain, where are my healers? Where are my DPS? Am I overextended now as a tank? Let's say like we realize that we're starting to get pressured off, and then we need to hold for a second and then restabilize. You have once you lose that convoy a little bit, you have the ability to start to push forward and create that space. That's what you're looking for. Now, if you were a tank, remember your job is disruptions. If you have a Venom who's flying above through the skies right here, right? if we're stalled here, they're the first person. This is the hard part, especially like Thor, Captain America. You'll be back here, you mess people up, and you have the idea just like a melee DPS to be over here, because Strange cannot do that. I've seen some Strange that can pull it off to a certain degree by using cover and then finding an area, but your job really is the front line. So be a little mindful of what your character's limitations are. Yes, you can outskill us to a certain degree, but also be a little realistic on what your character can achieve and should achieve within reason. So now we talk about that. A Venom will dive in. They'll start smacking up a few healers here, and then they'll back out. Once they're on blue, they go heal up. But guess what? As they're focused forward, every other character that we discussed, if they're not feeling the pressure here, or the melee DPS was waiting for that moment to come around as the Venom, this is where everything starts to overlap, is that you realize the melee DPS will start coming out like we saw Wolverine. Now that you've seen everything, everything starts to fit in terms of a bigger puzzle, as long as everyone's playing that same similar role. It's why moving as an amoeba is important, but realizing what part of the amoeba you take place as and what your job is. Because yes, having all 6 people here would be great, but pushing forward 6v6 as a group isn't always going to work. So you have to start to use strategy to poke and prod and say, where is your weak spot and who can we find out of position and where can we pull focus, even if it's just for a moment, to ensure that their front line does fall apart. Once that front line falls apart, as a Strange, as a even off tank as Magneto holding the front line, those are really important. So that can bring us to the next question as you're positioning. If I have nothing but front line, and then there's no dive, and all we're doing is pushing the front line. Let's say we have Squirrel Girl, we have Hela, we have Strange, we have Magneto, and we're looking at all of them, then we don't have any dive, and the only thing we hope for is that we out DPS the front. That's all you're hoping to do. So sometimes changing up that tactic and changing up legends can really shake things up, because they're so used to the pressure from the front line that they'll get overwhelmed by the back. So now let's talk about the dive just relatively quickly, and then we're going to speed run the point of interest 2 and 3 for the attack. And then what I'm hoping for as I defend, that I can do it all in one go, because I realize that this video is going to be very, very long. So I realized I mentioned that I'll try to speed it up as concepts started to make a lot more sense, and that you understood the map and you started to see everything for what it is and piecing it together. So let's deep dive now into, no pun intended, dive. All right, I'm going to be very honest. As a dive, your job is to mitigate information of where you're at and what you're doing. I would almost pretty much always recommend not going the direct route and making sure that you're taking the off route to make sure that nobody sees what you're doing and what you're thinking. You want to utilize your movement for the last moment, so if they saw you there, that's perfectly fine. But then as you move forward and you start to garner information, you can start to decide, hey, I'm going for the backline now, and you can assess to see what you want to do. So we did just a quick pan there. So I know it was very, very fast. If we go around and then you duck and hide underneath and go third person again, and then you assess to say, okay, well, I'm going forward. I see the healer in the back. I'm going for them. Then you do, you know, your little fun one-shot combo. You know, you web them up, sling them, and then you punch them, and then you get out, right? After you do your punch. Horrible example of the combo. I've done it before, but nonetheless, you've seen other videos. I'm just giving a quick example. But then after you do that, so let's just simulate that again. You know, you flew in, you know, you web them, and then you punch, and then you get out. And then you'll do it much better than I do. But that's the concept, because then you come back here, you heal up, and then you go right back in, and you find your moment of opportunity. You wait. You say, wait, I see somebody in the back line. I'm going to web him, and then pull him forward, and then I'm going to punch, and then I get out. And then go all the way back, and then assess. And you can climb on height. This is where the interesting part is, that you start doing things as Spider-Man that other people can't do in terms of dive, which is interesting, is you start to climb things, and then you find, you know what? I'm going to play a little bit like a Flier, and I'm going to move around just a little bit and then dodge some of this. And I'm going to start moving from point to point, from wall to wall. And then sometimes just being a little sticky, as Spider-Man says, things get a little sticky. Then you can start to wait and then find your moment to essentially strike. That's what you're looking for. Now, I know this was not the most elegant version. I did it in one take here just to kind of showcase as a quick example of a dive, but that is the core concept. Remember, if you're doing dive properly, that's going to be where your damage is. You're going to have high kills, but you're not going to match the highest damage of your fellow teammates, especially if you have Squirrel Girl, Storm, anybody who's able to do a lot more consistent DPS, Moon Knight as an example. You will not be that. Your job is to hope that you're not doing that much damage as dive, but being efficient and eliminating people where it matters, because any healer, anybody that you're able to get in terms of a close to one-shot combo and eliminate them is going to be the best thing that you can possibly do, because now it is a 6v5. Now, what we're going to discuss is the second and third point. Of course, as you look at the very tippy top, you'll see that we still have the second and third point. This will feel a little bit more like we're speed running it. The most important thing is that you understand the core concepts. If you want me to slow it down, I definitely can redo these sections. I had 8 different ways in which I wanted to do this video, and unfortunately, I realized that it was very long, and there's just so many different ways to go about it. So get back into it. So remember, we talked about how this area was extremely close and difficult for flyers, but then it opens up right away into this back part. This back part has healing just out the wazoo for flanks and finding a lot more areas. Now, the downside of doing this is that you do want to play together, but you also want to find the little areas in between. A lot of this stuff does get destroyed. You can hide underneath it. When you start seeing it blow up, you'll start seeing healing. A lot of these environments start to be destructible, which is one thing we didn't even discuss. We started hitting some stuff and destroying things, but it is important to realize what can be destroyed and what can't, and when you're finding alternate areas in which you can position and play. Now, as you start looking at some of these and you start even playing here, this is a nasty little area right here as well as you start moving forward, because you can see a lot and you have a lot of cover. Remember, there's certain characters when you're playing, let's say, for example, Squirrel Girl, where you don't even have to be in a whole line of sight. You can literally just dunk into the corner and they'll start blasting into another one. Or you start shooting down the hallway and it'll bounce off of something. You shoot up into the air, into the ceiling, and start bouncing off, you know? There's a lot that you can do in terms of positioning that you don't necessarily always have to take the direct route. You can find different areas, especially as a ranged DPS, and which way you want to do this. Now, is it always ideal to go for the flank? No, because the minute somebody realizes it, you're pretty much screwed. But nobody tends to think even of this area. This is crazy. This is crazy how much of this power gives you rather than just going for the most straightforward result. And if you're trying to go for a dive, that can be a very powerful spot. But also using the convoy is also just as effective. I've seen rockets just climb around this like absolute crazy, and they find a lot of success, which is why when you see these areas, remember, if you come to this area, you can always change. Let's go ahead and change, and let's give it just an example. We talked about Squirrel Go for a little bit. You don't have to be around the corner. You see how it's just bouncing off? There you go. You start to understand, like, what am I hitting there? You don't even have to see what's there, and you can hit somebody who's potentially hiding. You go to the back part of this area. I've seen people fight over here. It's not ideal because you get broken away from your team. There's a health pack over there. You start moving over here to the right. You don't have to be always in the front. You can start shooting. This is where Squirrel Girl gets a lot of power. Now, it's not always the same for everybody. See where I'm not even peeking about range, and that is going really far. Look at that. You see, it's hitting that back line. If there's healers there, which they're going to, just how we said, healers should, in theory, position this way so they're not pointed at the tanks. Then all that bouncing is going to become an absolute nightmare. It's going to become annoying and difficult to deal with. So just thinking about that, because now that you have the information, remember, that's why I say, just the unorthodox can always work as well. Just because I tell you one thing doesn't mean that now that you have that, oh, well, healers are always going to be stacked on the side, maybe now got to play closer. Maybe you got to start making some interesting decisions to throw people off. Throwing people off is important. It's like playing chess. It's like playing chess where if you think of something opposite, sometimes it can work. So now let's go hop back in, and let's talk about this from a melee DPS standpoint. Now, as we speed run again, we're going to do the melee DPS now. I'm going to add a Reed in here because he's a little interesting because he also flexes as a bit of a tank, and he's got some range to him, surprisingly. The biggest thing as a melee, as you're moving from this next point, is, I mean, Reed, which is interesting, can act like a makeshift tank and really eat a lot of damage, surprisingly, and especially when they go into their ultimate form, just how much they can pretend to be a tank. But the same thing happens with melee, where at the time you want to go for a flank and you want to find these little nuanced areas in the corner as well. There's a health pack over here. So anything I miss in the first run, I'm going to try to capture here. This is also great for range, just a little gentle reminder. But you do have the ability to use the convoy to find some positioning. There's definitely some height up here. Don't want you guys to figure about that at all. There's also these little cave areas right here. So as a melee, if you happen to be able to get up there, or if you happen to remember that they're going to be up there, if there's somebody you can pull down, somebody you can reposition, even as a melee to push them out over here, It's also going to be important, but you can also probably dodge a lot of it. Because what's the point of having them up here if everyone is already here, which is also pretty big, very important. And you can also take the side angle here if you want to be a little less direct. So a lot more nuance than you even think in terms of positioning, instead of just always taking the front line, because everyone just takes the same old approach. And that could be harder if you're a support, but if you're melee and range, you can get a lot more creative. So we went that side before. As a melee, this is probably, in my opinion, better than the range one, which is why I chose this path for melee, because at least you're right here and a lot closer, and you could just jump for it. Right here, it's not as bad, but I think this head glitch right here is a lot better for range. This one tends to lean itself a little bit more on the melee side if you happen to be on this side. So you're not stacking with your range if you don't want to have just 2 people there. Because trust me, having 2 people on the flank is never ideal. It's always better to have either 1 or 2. So make sure that you're not all diving. That maybe a lot of people are taking the direct approach. That you're tending to think a little bit more outside of the box as you're moving. So I'm trying to give that example. Like as a melee, I probably run over to the right because a little more straightforward, so I can get to the convoy right through here again. Again, you make your own decision, because there's also this for a melee as well, but you do have less of cover. That's why I'm thinking the right side is a little bit better for melee. Just my own personal opinion, because when it comes to this, I've seen people succeed as melee going the other route, but because the convoy and the tanks are closer for melee, and for you to kind of say, okay, well, I'm going to be with them now, I'm going over here, DPS them, and I can be right back if I need to. This path has a lot bigger of a line of sight, which is great for range. I think this is much better for range. But for read, at least, I mean, you could do it and do a little bit of a flex. No pun intended, to be a big boy Chad. Doom, 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 doom. That's the noise that the big boy Chad makes. And then start to move up. And like I said, even as a tank, as you start to move around, makes a really big difference. It's pretty sick, especially whenever you become big Reed Richards and then you pretty much makeshift as a tank. So having that knowledge as a melee DPS, it really leans into becoming a better tank. So as a tank, I would understand where healers are, what DPS are doing, and if you're a DPS, where your healers are going to be positioned, because that's the next one that we're going to talk about is healers. Because your healer is not always going to be taking a flank with you. It's not ideal. It's not best for them. So let's talk about that now. Now, this is the unfortunate part when it comes to playing a healer, is that sometimes it can feel like you're very limited by how good your tanks and DPS are. But now that we're a little more self-aware, we can start to try to encourage our tanks or healers and our healer teammate and our DPS teammate to be in different spots. You want to be as line of sight as much as possible, but you want to be LOS of your opponent. That is the concept most healers don't understand. You got to have both, best of both worlds. You want to be able to see your team, but also you want to be hidden from the team, which is what makes Invisible Woman so interesting, because you can essentially go invisible and then go to a different position. But of course, the downside, remember, the worst thing that can possibly happen to you is that you position into a weird and unique spot, and all of a sudden everyone jumps you because you are overextended. The biggest thing I encourage for most healers is be careful when overextending, that you are doing it as a team environment. You'll notice as I'm positioning, I'm not going too far to this side, and I'm staying within, I guess you could call it general reason of the convoy, because that is where everyone is going to be positioned. The last thing you want to do is say, okay, I'm going to go for the flank here. What? And that's the biggest red flag that you're going to have is what? Because then how long is it going to take you to get back to your teammates to heal? And then if you get caught up by yourself by 2 dive, you're pretty much screwed. So just kind of think outside the box, but I know it feels like you're on a tether, but imagine your tether is more or less like a circle around that general vicinity, so you can see as much as possible. But you want to be at least behind so you can see. You don't have eyes in the back of your head, and this is probably what frustrates most DPS, is that you could go really far up like this, but then you have 2 DPS behind you that are trying to hold further back, and then you're in trouble. So you have to be very self-aware as a healer to be as far back but not too close so you can see a majority in front of you. At least, like I said, 4 is going to be your best bet. But if you only have 2 within your LOS, you can't just turn up the FOV because the game doesn't let you. You need to back up and then hit everybody here as much as possible. Now, is that as fun? No, because then you're not going to be able to bounce a DPS off of them. Now, maybe you could do this if you realize that your momentum as a team is so strong that you don't have to worry about the back line. But of course, make sure that you understand, if you look at the enemy team, what do they have? Do they have dive? And are they going to start picking off your DPS? Because if they do, then you're going to lose your front line, and then your DPS is going to dwindle. So again, the same concept here. you know, if you got, let's say 3 here, and then you saw the Reed Richards was over here, and then you got a dive over on the left, and you got a healer to the right of you, then, you know, you're not necessarily worried as you start to push up. You can at least maintain a majority, and then the last DPS will come over and realize your limits. If you're looking at Invisible Woman, you do have a limit, so you might need to play a little forward to get everyone here, and you're pretty much going to have to keep flipping back and forth. But remember what that does to you and how much it exposes you in terms of overall positioning. So remember that tether. Remember how it feels just to be within that general vicinity. Don't overextend. If your all team is behind you and you go for a dive, you pull somebody in, then you throw your thing. Immediately, if you're going to do that, you better go back. And even then, I question why you would do it, because what if you got pulled in by a Bucky and got eliminated? If you got eliminated and you have to run all the way back from the start from what you were, that's not so good. That's looking pretty bad. That's rough. I would not recommend that. So now let's do tanks as our last and final one here, just talking about attacking on Convoy and Midtown. Remember, this is the last section when it comes to tanks. We could have done this video a million different ways, but I decided to settle for this, and hopefully that you find it helpful as we review everything. Every single tank and character has nuance, which is why this concept is so difficult. So I'm going to kind of show Groot, because we talked about Dive, we could have talked about Hulk, we've seen it in spectating. And remember, everything when we talk about points, as you notice as I'm moving, I'm going from point to point still, is still from the main positioning guide itself. The health packs can be a point, the positioning could be a point of interest, the main convoy as well. But even what Groot does to create some of those new points could also be so helpful. Because now you've walled off people, and now you only have, let's say you have one blocked out here, what that can do for you. It's really amazing the difference that it can make. So keep that in mind. A tank really creates a space in this area where everyone else can work around. It's, again, like the visual of football. Football, you got your frontline DPS. That is what a tank is. You got to have a great frontline, or else everything falls apart. If you don't have it, then you don't really have much of a team whatsoever. So when you think about this and we say, okay, we know where they're going to position, let's go ahead and block off this whole area. And then we have only one person here now with us that overextended. Well, there you go. A lot of characters like Groot can provide a lot of that power if somebody's trying to take the off angle over here and do something. It's amazing. So that's why I say, as more characters keep coming out, as everyone starts positioning differently, and we even have characters that can be designed to different roles, that's where it creates a lot of excitement and what they can do and disrupt the front line, just as much as we talk about Venom diving for the back, the Spider-Man, the Black Panther, anybody. They all have a purpose. Now, it depends on how your team is going to play and what that purpose is. Remember, if they were spawning over here and then you managed to push forward, you could essentially create just one opening for yourself and your team and deal with only what's on the right. That's amazing to be able to do. Each tank has a different power. You know, Magneto and, let's say, you know, Doctor Strange can be pretty similar, but they're still very nuanced and very different at the same time. You know, Strange is definitely a lot more straight, you know, when I say straightforward, it's not easy straightforward, but pushing the front line as hard as possible. Like Magneto can provide a lot of the damage, but it's not necessarily going to be in the front because he can't just keep eating damage endlessly. You know, he's got that main tank and off tank. And that's where I talk about the nuance of this game, where instantly I mention a few of those things and you say, well, I want to learn about that. And it's like, well, that's why we have multiple videos for this concept. And so I'm trying to figure out the nuance and how to make sure that I'm not overwhelming you guys, but also making sure I'm giving substantial information. So as we look at the tank, like I said, a great way for even if Groot wanted to dive the front line, even with the ultimate. Now you see it, pulled everyone in, put a wall here, wall off the healers, and then just DPS everyone down. Amazing, phenomenal, the power that Groot has, because it's very different compared to most other tanks, but every tank does provide a little bit different of power, especially those like Captain America and Thor that can provide that damage. So again, I hope you found this video helpful. Leave a like for part 2. I love doing this. I love exploring the map. I really even feel like I've learned even more just by going through the map. Sometimes just putting in this time can do so much for you to think outside the box and slow things down a little bit, because when you're in game, trust me, people default on habit and they just go through the same path and nothing ever changes. So thank you again. See you guys all in the next one.